Hello there. I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Texas Tech Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and this is another of our Institute Encounters in which we have a conversation with one of the distinguished scholars who we bring to Texas Tech to deliver lectures, but I think it's always nice to be able to sit down with them and talk at length about their work. Today's guest is Professor Paul Hollander. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, a sociologist with a strong interest in contemporary history. He's the author of 18 published works, including one that had a major influence on my own life, Political Pilgrims. His chief interest, though he has had a great many, has been in one might call the totalitarian temptation, the inclination of all sorts of people who should know better to fall into worshipful attitudes when faced with monstrous dictators and regimes. But he's written a great many things, and we're going to try to cover some of that ground today. So, welcome, Paul. It's very good to have you out here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And let's begin. You know, one of the things that when I was reading Political Pilgrims so long ago, one of the things that fascinated me was not just how so many intellectuals could have these wonderful, dreamy notions about what life was like in the Soviet Union or in China, but how they could so dislike the country in which they lived, which gave them the freedom and usually quite a bit of affluence to live lives that people elsewhere could hardly imagine. I know that anti-Americanism certainly has been one of the continuing themes of your work. Could you tell me how you got interested in it and what sort of things you've had to say chiefly about it?
Well, when I first arrived to the West, that was London, in 1957, when I started being a student in London.
You had escaped from Hungary, if I
Right,
recall.
right. And I had the same kinds of feelings, that I was puzzled, and I didn't fully understand why so many Western academics, intellectuals, and some of my fellow students were so disenchanted with their own country or society. Although I think that became more intense when I came over here 3 years later. I don't think I had this very strong feeling when I was in England, perhaps in part because I don't know what's wrong with my voice today, because that was still after the Hungarian Revolution, so that made a certain impression on people in the West. And there was also a little bit of a guilty conscience for the Western countries not doing something to help the revolution. So, well, I suppose it's difficult now to separate my present-day conclusions about these matters and how I felt at the time. They converge, but obviously one basic aspect of the situation you described was that people in the West, including very well-educated people, knew very little about what the communist systems were like. I think that was a major factor. And secondly, they were hoping that, that applies to intellectuals mainly, that there would be some alternative to the problems of their own societies. That goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, or the time of the Russian Revolution, that we were looking for alternatives to whatever was wrong with Western capitalist societies. But the other thing is that I think there are just these people we are talking about, one thing they have in common is a certain idealism, high expectations about how much societies might be improved for human beings. And I think also as I increasingly felt that many people made this point that politics in our times has taken the place of religion to some degree. So what used to be religious beliefs have become political beliefs.
Well, you say that they were idealists and they wanted to see a great improvement in the way societies were organized. But of course, if they had a little bit of historical perspective by the middle of the 20th century, they would have realized that a great improvement had indeed occurred, and had occurred in the very societies that they were kind of decrying. How come that did not impress itself on them? How come they didn't make that?
That's an interesting question, and especially since I was just reading the new book of Steven Pinker about progress, and of course he's totally different. I mean, he's a unique character in this regard because he believes in progress.
He's a modern day philosopher.
Yes, but I know I would like to understand. He's very different. I don't think you find anybody like him with a similarly fervent belief in progress.
It's good somebody is making the case.
I mean, I think he goes a bit overboard.
Uh-huh.
I mean, as far as moral progress is concerned, yes, technological, scientific progress, that's indisputable. But, well, I think that white people overlook the achievements of their own society as well, because they took it for granted, they were used to it. I mean, again, if you talk about American society, I think there are certain things which are unattractive about American society, especially popular culture. And there as I made this point in my first book on anti-Americanism, that I share some of this anti-Americanism in regard to popular culture, which I also dislike. And
What do you think is wrong with it?
what is wrong with it? Well, that it presents an untruthful picture of life in many ways.
When you say popular culture, what are you specifically
I
referring
mean much of television,
to?
movies, popular music.
And how does it paint a
Some
view of
bestsellers. Well, I would say that one way to say how they paint a false picture, things are oversimplified. In these stories, human problems are solved far too easily and implausibly.
You don't think that was true of literature, say, in the 19th century?
Depends what literature you're
Right.
talking about. Not good literature, I don't think so.
So you think that damages us?
Well, I mean, it's hard to measure the damage.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, actually, this is a part of the Pinker book I strongly disagreed with. He had this idealistic notion that now people have all these technological devices at their disposal and more free time, so they are just going to make the most of realizing their intellectual potentials.
It'll all be Steve Pinker's.
Yes,
he
and I
thinks.
mean, the fact of the matter is, that you go to a concert and you see very few young people.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That kind of problem. And as we all know, students read much less. So, but let's see more about how popular culture, what's wrong with it, besides this kind of false picture of life. And, well, of course, it's a form of escapism, and well, we all need some sort of escapism.
Do you worry about its pornographic nature?
No, not especially. No more than the rest. I mean, I don't know if the pornographic part is the worst or not. And whether or not pornography actually makes people behave worse, I don't know. And I mean, very few people know. So, but I remember a book I read a very long time ago, a book by Aldous Huxley, which he wrote in the 20s, and I read it a very long time ago. and I was sort of very impressed by it. And it was a kind of a travel book. He travels around the Riviera in France and sees all, this was in the 20s, and he sees all the rich people. And he considers that wasting their time, with useless pursuits. And he somehow comes to the conclusion that now in our times, more and more ordinary people who are not rich are also beginning to waste their time in the way the rich did.
Mm-hmm.
That once this was a privilege, but
Mm-hmm.
now it's
Mm-hmm.
much more
Mm-hmm.
accessible
Mm-hmm.
to everybody.
And that worried him.
Yes, I mean, it's sort of, he found it aesthetically unappealing, and just as, I find it aesthetically unappealing when I see a kind of frenzied crowd at a pop music concert.
Mm-hmm.
There is something unappealing. It's just like a frenzied crowd at a political meeting.
Oh, I see. So you could replace the band with Mussolini, and they'd be equally turned on by
Well,
it.
I don't know. I don't know that it would be equally turned on. But I'm thinking more about what's wrong with popular culture. Well, again, I mean, I think that high culture makes an attempt to somehow come to terms with the human condition,
Uh-huh.
and popular culture doesn't.
Well, do we still have a high culture though that,
Yeah.
that grapples with those kinds of things? For
Well, I
those
mean,
who
we used to have some good writers like
Yeah.
Saul Bellow
Mm-hmm.
or Philip Roth,
Mhm.
both my favorite American
So
writers.
they're leaving the stage, and you don't see a replacement.
Well, I don't know. I am not
Mhm.
sure. Maybe there is. Maybe there will be. I don't know. I never dare to predict anything.
So coming back to kind of anti-Americanism, you can certainly still find it very much alive and well, and especially on our campuses, but perhaps in other major institutions that have been influenced by American education. Why does it? Does it persist largely out of ignorance? You think because people don't understand how far we've actually come and how better off we are in most respects, or maybe every respect, from the people who've lived in the past and elsewhere? Or is there some other reason?
I think that's certainly part of it. But the intellectual currents of the '60s have very much survived
Mm.
in academia, certainly. And now I had this wave of people treating women badly, and new information about that. And your policemen treating blacks badly, that kind of thing. But these are not new, but they got more attention, or there is more information about it.
Maybe Steve Pinker would say that's a sign of progress, that we're now worried about things that we.
Well, you could say that.
Hmm?
Yes, sure. Right. And one point which Pinker makes, I fully agree with, but it's a sign of progress, that animals are treated better,
Yes,
and people are more concerned with that.
and you think that's a fact and a good sign.
Yes,
You
because
agree with him
I
on
am
that,
very
right?
much. I like animals too, and I'm a former dog and cat owner.
So why do you think we treat animals better?
You mean compared to the past?
Yes.
Well, because I think that has to do with the standard of living. People have animals as pets, and peasants had them to guard the house or
Pull the plow, or
the plow.
yeah.
And I think also, people project on animals the best human traits,
Hmm.
and it's easy to have a good relationship. Much easier to have a good relationship with a dog than with people, including your own children.
So simultaneously with our greater regard for animals, we also take a dimmer view of our own species.
Yes,
So increase.
that's true.
What do you think those things are related?
Well, I don't know if we did not take a dimmer view of our own
Well, we
species.
think we're a cancer on the planet, to
Well,
quote
that
Susan
was
Sontag.
Susan
But
Sontag.
other people, ecologists, people who are strongly sort of predisposed to saving the environment, often think of human beings as sort of ruinous and destructive.
Well, yes, I mean, I share a lot of that, you know. I am very much a romantic environmentalist. And I think there is a certain human short-sightedness about these things, you know, that you can just do these things and then you think there will always be fish to catch and trees to cut down and so forth. I mean, it's a very mixed bag, human rationality and irrationality. Very mixed bag. And it's not that difficult to, you know, conjure up irrationality. I mean, this is again a big issue in the Pinker book, you know, human rationality, reason.
So he thinks that we're becoming steadily more reasonable.
Yes, he does.
And you have questions about that.
Right, I do.
And if it was Pinker who was sitting here rather than Steve Balch, what would you say to him?
Well, I would agree with him that, you know, we have made progress in matters like that there is no longer public torture, but there is private torture behind closed doors. But I mean, it's still a step forward. That is, you don't lynch people in public, but there are a few countries which still have public executions and people enjoy attending them. There is never a lack of audience at a public execution. And then you have the continuum in popular culture, much of which is also quite violent. I mean, a lot of sports are very violent. Martial game, martial arts and whatnot. And people just beat up each other.
So we simply displaced these things into a virtual world?
Well,
Is that why we don't need them anymore in real life?
Well, I don't know if it's actually happening, but people clearly enjoy these violent spectacles. Boxing and all that stuff.
Could you imagine a recrudescence of public cruelty?
Well, no, it's difficult to imagine it in Western cultures.
Of course, they had a good deal of that during the Cultural Revolution in China,
Sure.
didn't they?
Now that was a spectacular occasion. I mean, they specialized in public humiliation. That was most unusual because the Russians didn't do it. The Nazis did a little, but not that much. The communists in general didn't do it. It was a Chinese special.
And was that sort of reflection of the sort of shame culture of a sort of collectivist society?
Could be, but also, I read a lot about that, and clearly the people enjoyed it, both the actual perpetrators and the audiences. And it started with ideology, but it was
Human nature, you think that?
Just enjoying using your power.
What else would you say to Pinker? I mean, you'd admit he's right about certain things, but what do you think he's overlooking?
Well, he's overlooking this huge potential for irrational behavior, and that human beings believe what they want to believe to a large degree.
So allowing for the fact that he's right about the specifics, that is to say, indeed there are trends away from cruelty and brutality and all that sort of thing. We want to treat each other in a more compassionate way than we did in the past, and we often, generally speaking, we kind of manage to do so. What set of factors could change that? If human nature is still beneath the surface, seething and ready to erupt, what combination of circumstances might bring about the eruption?
Well, obviously scarcities, but I mean not just material scarcities, because I think that, you know, Trump's popularity had to do not with material scarcities, but more with people feeling not getting enough respect and status and this kind of thing. And I mean, we have this enormous popularity of being victimized, competition for victim status.
So do you think that's a dangerous path to follow vis-a-vis what Pinker wants to see, or what we'd all want to see, actually.
I don't remember if Günther writes about this victim phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Could that produce cruelty?
Yes, because of course if you feel victimized, then you can do bad things to other people with a clear conscience.
Mm-hmm. So we're encouraging a psychology of revenge.
Well, there is some of that. I think there is a very spiteful atmosphere at these political rallies, which Trump has, and close to violence.
So you think the rise of Trump is a symptom of this
Yes.
consensus about compassion becoming undone?
Well, I think it's a symptom. You can look at it in many ways, but yes, it is being undone. But you could also say that the rise of Trump is a kind of a reaction to the excesses of political correctness. I think that's also the case. You might even say that it's a symptom of racism. It's possible. And I think a lot of people are unhappy with having a man like Obama president, not because of his personal qualities, but because of his skin color.
So you think that the sort of multi-ethnic nature of our society is putting strains on the liberal consensus in which we
And this has been happening for a long time.
more strains than in the past?
Well, I don't know. It's more obviously not more than when people were being lynched
Right.
and not allowed to be on the bus on the same platform. Certainly not. But I always felt in the academic environment that the charges of racism were exaggerated. But maybe it has gone underground to some extent, and it comes out in this way, like admiration for somebody like Trump.
So are you kind of pessimistic about the future of our society and Western society more generally? All the things that Tinker would celebrate?
Well, I don't know. I always feel that it's so difficult to predict anything, because I'll give you one example. I never thought that I would see the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was convinced that it was very durable.
Peacefully, relatively peacefully,
right.
too. Yeah.
So that I couldn't imagine how that would happen. And so I cannot imagine major dramatic shifts in the Western world, but they may come, I don't know. I don't know what happens when China runs out of water and things like that.
So, is there anything particularly that is it the possibility that the economic system might start to deteriorate, and is that one of your chief worries?
It is. Well, I think this movement of people is a problem. I just read this little piece in the New York Times a few days ago. I don't try to remember who wrote it. Some liberal wrote it on the op-ed page about the population growth in Africa. People, a large portion of Africans would like to go to Europe. But how many people can Europe absorb? And, I am a former refugee, so I can understand this thing. But still, I think I was somewhat easier to assimilate than some people from Namibia or wherever. So it's a real problem.
You've recently been researching the problem, not the problem so much as the concept of evil that people bring to an analysis of political events. And what it is that evil is a very strong word. It's a word that if you use nowadays, people will shake their head and think you're some sort of theologian, and you're conjuring up an image of the devil. As someone who's studying evil, how do you define it?
Well, let me tell you that this interest began with my friendship with Stanley Milgram. We were colleagues at Harvard, and we were very good friends, even though we did very different work. And he thought of himself as a real social scientist, quantitative and so forth, which I never did of myself. But still, we liked each other and so forth. So And then a few years ago, well, once we actually wrote an article together, which was published. Anyway, a few years ago, I was asked to give a paper at a conference of all places in Russia about the work of Stanley Milgram. They had a whole conference on the obedience experiments. And I was going to go, but then I changed my mind. I didn't feel like going, but I did write a paper, and it was actually presented. So anyway, that is relevant to the issue of evil because Stanley Milgram shared this concept of Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil. But the banality of evil sort of deprives evil of its real meaning or profundity because it's so ordinary. That's the idea that anybody can do evil things. And I think Arendt was wrong about that. I mean, she was specifically wrong about Eichmann, who was an ideologue, and he really felt that killing the Jews was very important and useful and will make the world better. So, so I thought that these obedience experiments...
You want to describe them for people who aren't familiar with what the obedience experiments are?
But they were sort of very, very original. The idea was that it was supposed to be a learning experiment, that people are asked certain questions, and if they give the wrong answer, they get a little electric shock. And that the worse, the shock could be increased in relation to the number of errors, something like that. But of course, they were not in reality getting an electric shock, but somebody performed and behaved as if he had been getting them. So, what was interesting about it, and what got the most attention, that people were willing to do this and give these electric shocks to people only because the experimenter told them to do so. And that even though the subject was in apparent agony, and they would still do it. So this was obedience to authority. And so from this came this broader idea that, killing the Jews was just another case of some authority figure telling you that you don't have to worry about the ethical aspects of this. You told this because that's your position in the hierarchy. So, but I think what was wrong with this idea that this only applied to the low-level people, who pulled the trigger or shot people in the gas chambers. And even a lot of those thought that this was nothing wrong with doing this. Maybe they were not enthusiastic about it. But it didn't apply clearly to the people who devised the whole scheme. So, that was one mistake about the scheme. And so, and also then there has been much new information that in fact the Germans could refuse to do these things, and they didn't get punished if they refused to shoot the Jews. And a small number didn't do it, and nothing happened to them. So the obedience to authority wasn't that risky. I mean, disobedience. Mm-hmm. So which suggests that they didn't mind doing it that much. Mm-hmm. So, but I think it was an appealing idea, because again, it thought that something is deeply wrong with modern society. I mean, that's what people liked about it, that it could happen anywhere. That was sort of the message.
You mean they thought that perhaps in earlier societies people would not have been as obedient, and this was just a modern problem?
No, but they felt that even in modern democratic societies
we hadn't overcome that. So
liked that.
Whatever Steve Pinker might think, people were still willing to do this. So where have your own investigations led you on this matter?
Well, I think you could say that yes, I have written a little bit about this issue of the evil. Of course, a lot of people, and the way they handled evil to consider it as a form of psychopathology, an aberration. That by definition, something is wrong with people who enjoy inflicting pain. And then, of course, you take out the moral aspect if it's a mental issue, something in your brain. And the choice is, of course, the crucial. For moral judgment, we have to believe that people can make choices. And I mean, I always taught in my classes in sociology, whatever I taught, with this matter of to what extent, our choices are socially or environmentally determined, and to what extent they seem to be freely chosen, and it's extremely difficult to draw the line. And I mean, you would have to think of some very inhumane experiments to test this matter, how would people behave in different settings and so forth, and obey different commands and whatnot. So you could say also that a lot of evil, I mean, this kind of huge amounts of suffering come about because people try to implement some very idealistic scheme. And in a way, you could even say the Nazis were idealistic because they thought they would create a better world if the Jews are removed, or the Gypsies.
Has anyone raised this question about the people who did the murdering in the Soviet Union? Is there worry about, is this seen as a test case in people's ability to do evil, or is it assumed that they had reasonable grounds for doing this sort of thing?
There has been nothing comparable to the studies of Nazis and Nazis about the SS in the Soviet Union. I mean, I happen to know from my readings, and I can think of one particular case which I often mention as a good example of somebody who really enjoyed doing this. And it wasn't, you couldn't call it at all the banality of evil. You heard about the so-called murders at Katyn.
Right.
Katyn, that was when the Russians killed several thousand Polish military prisoners of war officers because they belonged to the Polish elite. And there was an interesting case because for a long time the Western countries believed that it was done by the Nazis, because the Nazis first found these mass graves, and then they said, of course, they were done by the Russians, which happened to be true, but nobody believed the Nazis. But anyway, that was clear that it was done by the Russians. And there was this one case, he's mentioned in many studies. There was a particular Soviet general who was in charge of this operation, and he himself put on a kind of a rubber apron, and he was shooting people every night. He shot hundreds of them. He didn't have to do this. His underlings were doing it, but he obviously enjoyed doing it. Now, and also that his colleagues thought he was otherwise quite a nice guy. So, when you run into cases like that, then the concept of evil seems to have some independent existence. That people who.
So is it true that most of the people who did these kinds of things, or many of them at least, were not kind of depraved criminal types, but were in other environments quite ordinary and maybe even pleasant people?
I don't think we know. What mixture. Some didn't enjoy it, and it's very. But then you see, you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and you see all these pictures of these SS people next to the mass graves smiling, and send these pictures to their family. So there were some of those.
So presumably they thought their families would find this kind of laudable.
Yes.
So under what? So in your own researches on evil, is one of the questions that you're trying to answer whether most ordinary people, under some circumstances, are willing to do things that would, in the plain light of day, be thought of as evil?
Well, I can't say this is exactly what I'm trying to find out, because I don't know if I could.
Mm.
But I mean, I'm certainly interested in this question. But I am more interested in my current work or current research. What kind of conceptions of human beings or human nature inspires violence?
I see. Uh-huh.
It's what I call personifications of evil,
Mm.
which was for the Nazis, it was the Jews, and for the communists it was the class enemy, and for the Islamic radicals it's the infidels.
Mm-hmm.
And now what exactly in these ideologies and the propaganda, how do they present these political enemies, and what's really wrong with them, and why they should be, taken care of one way or the other.
Do you have any hypotheses about it at this point?
Well, there seems to be only thing which is fairly obvious, that these conceptions of enemy, political enemy or evil, are somewhat similar. And you could even say that they are somewhat like projections, that they are presenting the enemy as ruthless and unprincipled. And that's interesting. That's a problem, because you see, especially I looked into this in the Soviet case, that they had this conflict to present the enemy as principled or unprincipled, which is worse. Because if he is principled, then he could do more damage.
So this was an argument that went on in
Well,
the...
it was an implicit argument, not a real
I see.
argument. But I was looking, one of my sources which I used, and I'm going to use, the speeches of the prosecutor in the Purge trials.
Mm.
That's Vyshinsky, who was really, you could say, he was a terrible human being. And
In his private life, he was
well,
terrible.
I don't know about his private life, but he was, he was one of the most loyal helpers of Stalin,
Mm.
and he was really in charge of the major Purge trials. And so the way he described the accused in the Purge trials, he actually tried to present them as just ordinary criminals without any principles. But he really didn't get very far trying explaining why did they do the supposedly terrible things. Just by they hated the Soviet system, but many of them were, of course, pro-Soviet for early life, communists. So he just had this kind of implicit view that they were really evil people, but we don't quite know why. And sometimes, in a few cases, they were supposedly bribed and got money from Western intelligence services. But there was no real, or the class background. Well, that some of them, when this was said, not so much about the major people, but the so-called kulaks, the more prosperous peasants in the Soviet Union, that they were anti-Soviet because they lost their land. Well, that's a very simplistic class explanation. But the Nazis actually, they went to much greater length in presenting the Jews as evil. And again, it's even that it's not quite clear where it came from. It's some kind of a racial argument that somehow it's really part of their nature, as if it was part of their genes, their genealogy, and why they were trying to corrupt the whole world. I mean, it's just a much more elaborate fantasy than the Soviet or the communist. But I suppose you would have to go to some religion to find some real theory of evil.
Mm-hmm. Where...
But I mean, evil in religion, it gets problematic. Why did God create evil? Well, I suppose it's somehow to test the good people. And you couldn't have a moral system without good and evil. So it's
So in order to be good, we have to have a notion of what evil
Something
is.
like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody has a good theory of evil. I mean, or to put it in more social scientific term, human aggression. Well, and I don't know actually what Freud said. Where did it come from? And it was very much part of our nature. Where exactly it came from, I'm not sure. He said or explained. So, I mean, I think it's an empirical fact that some people, a small number probably, enjoy inflicting pain and suffering. And that to me, is an acceptable definition of evil.
Mm.
But where it comes from, that's difficult to say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it because they didn't get enough affection from the parents, or something like that? You know?
So, say a soldier in war dropping an atomic bomb probably has some qualms, but thinks nonetheless that he should do it because the war is a just one, and the bomb, in the case of Japanese, will bring the war to an end. I assume that was sort
Yes,
of
I
the
think
logic.
that was a fairly.
So, in the case of the Soviets, you had an exploitive class. If you sort of got rid
Yes,
of,
it's an ends and means thing.
yeah, right, and you know the Nazis might have said something similar. So, if people are, or if you're religious, these people are the sort of, they haven't come over to the right side. They are the minions of Satan, and the world would be better off without them, or at least if they're forced to kind of change their ways. So all those folks can do brutal things. Are they abnormal when they do it, or is that a way of you know, maybe is that a typically human way of justifying being aggressive?
I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is. And that's the way to do bad things with a clear conscience. If you do it for a good project. And you don't have any personal benefit from it. You know. Now it's different, you know, in Rwanda, you could say where they killed the Tutsis because they got their land,
Mm-hmm.
or their animals. I mean, that was, but of course they were also demonized, the Tutsis.
But that's if you kind of expropriate the expropriators,
Yeah.
you're getting their stuff. You know, they certainly took a lot of stuff from the Jews in
Right.
Germany, so there
But
was
I
always
don't
an element of taking
There
stuff
was
away.
some
Yeah.
of that, but I don't think it was the major element
Mhm.
with the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
It was from in Rwanda. It was.
So, I mean, is it? What about the case of dropping the atomic bombs? Were those people doing evil, or can you sometimes do those things and have a really good justification?
Yes.
Mhm.
No, I mean, I think it was a more clear-cut case, bombing the German cities and killing a lot of civilians,
Right.
and
Mhm.
there was no good military reason for that.
Now, of course, the pilots who were flying the planes didn't know that. That was not
Right.
that was above their pay grade.
Right.
But do you think the people who ordered it, who were presumably
Well, I
trying to demoralize
Yeah, that
Germans, right?
Yes, but also supposedly Churchill personally
Right.
felt that they really deserved it because they look what they did to Coventry and so on.
I see. So there was a revenge
There
element
was a
there.
revenge
It's
element.
pure revenge,
Yeah, it was some of
and that's not rational.
no.
No.
Well, I mean, you're right.
You won't do it next time if we punish you
Well,
for what
it's
you did this
rational
time.
in that it gives you an emotional gratification.
Uh-huh.
So it's
But aren't there instances in which, you know, your punishment of someone else is a way of keeping them from repeating the behavior?
yes, but that's a theory of one theory of correction of punishment.
There's a
Deterrence.
certain common sense to that. That
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're kind of suggesting here that doing evil is kind of an intellectual mistake. That is to say, there are some circumstances, like perhaps dropping the atomic bombs which led very rapidly to the surrender of Japan, where you could argue there was a pretty compelling reason for doing it. The alternatives were worse. But there are some situations where the theory, in the eyes of an objective observer, say, though not always at the time, seems utterly fallacious,
Right.
and therefore what you're doing is evil. Is that the difference? Whether
And I
your
think
judgment is
it
right or
could-
wrong?
It could be a difference, yes. I mean, there was absolutely no rational reason for the Holocaust, and also in the Soviet case.
Though not in the minds of the people who did it.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, in the minds of the people who did it, there was a good
Right.
reason, because they were convinced of the evil of the Jews.
Right.
But
So it's an intellectual mistake in some significant respect.
Yeah.
And does having a lot of ideology around make those mistakes more likely, or is ideology, if we kept people away from thinking about these great questions about how society should or should not be organized, if they just minded their own business and went to work every day and obeyed the law, presumably we'd be less likely to make these horrific mistakes.
Possible. But I think also human beings get a great pleasure out of blaming something else for your own problems. I think that's a basic psychological gratification.
Just to kind of briefly change the subject before we end here, you've done some work on people who engage in computerized dating. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And what brought you to study that?
I tell you what.
We go from evil to love.
What brought me to that was simply reading the personal columns of the New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the certain recurring themes there. And what I found especially interesting, that all the people writing there, obviously they think of themselves as very unique individuals with their unique interests and preferences. And in the end, they turned out to be very similar and standardized about their values and beliefs.
So what you looked at were people who advertised looking for mates.
Who advertised. And what they said about themselves and what they were looking for. And I just thought that was an interesting case of sort of appearance and reality, in that, I mean, that they were very much kind of successors of the counterculture, or the mentality was countercultural, you know. And they, also interestingly enough, most of the people who advertised were women looking for men. And of course most of them were also middle-aged or older, so it's a skewed sample of population, but most of them also seem to be highly educated. And well, what I found interesting, they were looking for some sort of romantic love relatively late in life.
How did they present themselves? What did they think would attract someone?
Well, it was extremely stereotypical,
Yeah.
what they said about themselves, you know. They said things like, you know, they were curious and active and irreverent and adventurous and, you know, interested in good culture and liked to go to Europe, to little villages and not to big cities.
Those themes would repeat themselves again and again.
So it's a kind of romantic, warmed up romantic ideas.
What did men say about themselves?
Similar things, basically. Yeah.
So I guess there were a lot of harmonious relationships that came out of
We
this.
don't know. You know, what was interesting, that also in the computer generated ads, nobody would make any reference to money. And by contrast, I remembered way back, there used to be such ads in some Hungarian newspapers, people looking for partners, and they were all totally down to earth, and they said,
this was
even under the communist
under
system.
the communists. People did that under the communists.
There was some of that people would say things like, I own my own apartment, and I have a telephone, and I have a good living, and I don't drink, things like that.
So lower expectations.
Nothing
very
romantic.
practical.
Yes, right.
Did you talk to any of these people and find out what happened? No.
But that would be a totally different project.
I see.
And I don't think people would want to. And what I sort of did also in that book, I compared these conceptions of romantic love and romantic fulfillment with what you find in famous romantic novels.
No?
I did that.
And you think that they were influenced by that?
No,
No.
But there were similarities. No, I don't think they read the famous romantic novels like Goethe's Werther. That was a good example. But they were somewhat similar. I mean, there was this famous American romantic book a few years, maybe 10 years ago. I don't remember the name or the title, but the story was that there is this man going around in Iowa, in the countryside, a photographer, and he meets this woman.
Oh, is it Bridges of Madison
That's
County?
it,
Yeah.
that's it. No, that was the totally romantic story,
Uh-huh.
you know. And that was a huge success. It appealed to people. I made reference to that in the book. Yeah. And of course it was a short-lived affair, totally impractical, and the woman was married and she didn't want to divorce her husband.
So this is another kind of fantasy. A lot of your work sort of
Well, I mean,
looks at fantasies of various sorts, whether they're
appearance and
evil.
reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. Very interesting. I mean, propaganda and advertising. And I mean, I have this morbid fascination also with advertising.
Oh. What are you interested in about that?
Well, just again, the appeals of advertising. But mostly, when I look at these TV commercials between the news, which I do every night. I watch the news, and I'm just struck by that. But you see, this is another reason why people don't like capitalism, because advertising is just basically so deeply misleading. It's deeply misleading because endlessly they ads try to convey that from a particular product you get all kinds of fulfillments which have nothing to do with the product itself. It's invariably presented in some kind of emotional context, family or a couple, and people just love each other because the implication is because they consume particular shampoo or toothpaste or whatever. Now that's deeply misleading.
So a common denominator in your work is how people are misled by my ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's something, not, well, just the nature of it, whether or not it works, that's another question. But I remember, I mean, this started with communist propaganda when I was growing up, which was easy to see that it was false and misleading.
Did they use the same images as commercial advertisers? No. There were images of families in communist propaganda, weren't there? Sort of heroic, no?
It was more rudimentary and more openly didactic, not very sophisticated. But the point of it was a complete misrepresentation of reality, which you could check daily from your personal experience.
Well, you really covered the ground in sociology and in a way that a great many others don't. Your work's been very important to a lot of people, including myself, and I just want to thank you very much for being here with us today.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.